short while ago I was talking about target visibility, and that was an example of where the terrain would physically block the ability for the artillery to even see the battalion, and you had to be able to see at least 2 figures of infantry or a single figure of cavalry, or at least the majority of an artillery battery, to be able to even fire upon it, to register the cannon onto it. But there are other aspects of firepower which could be restricted too, based upon the nearness or the closeness of a friendly formation, or the actual terrain feature itself might just simply reduce the firepower effect. So for example, we have a couple of batteries here in line, and they have this wall in front of them. Now normally, unless it's specifically denoted on the terrain that it will block physically the line of sight, most terrain doesn't block line of sight. It will just reduce the firepower effectiveness. Keep in mind, most weaponry of this period is all direct fire. That basically means you got to be able to see the enemy, there's nothing in between, it's direct fire, and if there's any object in between, it's simply going to block the firepower. So in this case, this low stone wall, which might be only a couple feet off the ground, is going to impede some of the effective fire against this cavalry regiment. So when you fire the artillery battery, you would have to reduce it by the stone wall because you're firing across it. It's the same if the cavalry was actually positioned directly behind the stone wall. So firing across the terrain feature in any way causes reduction of possible firepower. And I think it's down a quarter or something like that if I remember for a lone stone wall. It's all covered on the terrain effects or artillery firepower modifiers on your charts. Next example here is we have this end gun. Now normally its angle of fire would be someplace across this face of this square. But no artillery commander, at least worth his salt, is knowingly going to fire into a friendly formation. But in the period, keep in mind, this is the smoke of the battlefield, and it was pretty thick at times. So half the time the artillery is just firing away, and they will impact their own friendly troops as they're advancing upon the enemy. Lots of examples of this. Nothing worse than being in the middle of the battlefield and having your friendly guns on one side firing, and the enemy guns in front of you firing, and you just happen to be the target of opportunity between them. Because the smoke of the battlefield, literally, they don't even know they're doing it half the time. But in this example, this square is directly adjacent to the battery. And normally it would be able to fire out here at this angle. But because of the face of the square, the angle is reduced from the 22 to literally straight ahead along the edge of the square. So if there was an enemy formation over here, it couldn't be engaged by the artillery. This would be a restrictive edge. Over this side is still at 22.5 degrees. So terrain or friendly figures or units could restrict the firing arc. Now let's say there was another battalion, friend or foe, right here. It could be a friendly unit or it could be an enemy unit. It makes no difference. For the artillery to be able to fire through this gap, it needs to be at least the width of the battery. In other words, if this was only a 1-inch gap, sort of like that, this battery would be prevented from firing through this little gap to engage the cavalry. Even though it can see the one figure, it doesn't have the fire lane or the fire width. Because these guns come on line, and they're all in a linear line. And they're not going to turn the guns slightly inwards to fire through gaps. They're just firing straight ahead. That's what tactical doctrine was done. It's not like a modern artillery battery, which has got a lot more control for the individual cannons. So friendly or enemy troops could, in this case, restrict your firepower. In this case, more than likely, you're going to shoot at this threatening infantry anyway. But it could be a case where you might want to say something back there. Next example is over here on the left side. In some cases, the terrain has certain types of artillery fire have no effect. So, in this case, we have a low hedge. We've got an Austrian column hiding behind. If you were to look at the chart and you were firing from this battery and you fired round shot, this hedge causes no reduction to firepower at all. So just because there's terrain on the battlefield, don't assume automatically that it's giving you protection from artillery firepower. The 8-pounder balls going through those hedges and not even noticing, literally is what was saying. But if it was a stone wall, it would have reduction in effect. But if I fire canister shot or case shot, there is a reduction. So close attention to the artillery modifiers on the artillery firepower charts would be required, depending upon the type of terrain. Now in some cases, players wish to put their guns into a square, and I've covered this on another video. But to be a quick recap, if you wish to put a battery into a square, and the battery's in good morale order at the time it enters the square, you just pick up the gunner figure, put him in the square, and remove the actual battery base. It's assumed that the square, when it fires, can fire 1/3 of the cannon out in any particular direction. So you've got an 8-gun battery, 1/3 rounding up would be 3 cannons effective fire. If the gun was in a morale disordered state at time of entering the square, and that's a special unique rule, because normally you don't mix morale disordered and good order formation units, then the gunner's same step would put the gunner into the square, remove the base. But in this case, the guns are incapable or unavailable for firepower. They're in a morale disordered state. And until that actual battery crew rallies up to good standing, can the guns then resume their normal firepower on the parameters of the square. Our gunner, when you leave the square, you pull the battery off from the side of the table and march it away from the square. Or in this case, if they just want to come out here and unlimber, they can so do it. Remember, artillery has that unique maneuver capability of moving a short distance, especially if it's field artillery, typically 4 inches, and pay a 2-inch movement cost to unlimber in place and be positioned to fire.